post-grad semantics. We look a little different now because we're using Uvu instead of Google Plus Live Hangouts because we really sadly lost one of our webcasts and it traumatized us. So we had to change venues so that will never, ever happen again.
We had this amazing interview with Will Tully, who's in Night Fevers. He's a drummer in Night Fevers, and we did our first Dear Imprudence column, which we were both so excited about, and then somehow the video got lost during processing. But luckily, Uvu records and backs up all of our videos, so there will be no chance of any kind of losing of footage over technical difficulties.
And another difference in our webcast now is we're going to split it into different sections. So this is one standalone section. We're going to try to do 2 sections a week, one with just Caitlin and I, where we're talking about things we're interested in, and another with our guest. So this is the Caitlin and I section for this week.
We thought we'd talk about this week regional differences because we just interviewed Christy, and she's from Kansas and moved from Kansas to New York City, and that was a really big transition for her. And as someone who moved from Connecticut, and my family is from Yonkers, all the way to Kansas, I noticed regional differences a lot as well. And Emi has had a kind of interesting upbringing. She was actually born in Germany and has moved all over the place, so...
Yeah, most of my life that I remember has been in the Midwest, in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. But I have been a couple of places. And my parents, I guess my dad is from Nebraska, so he's kind of from the Midwest. But my mom was born in Japan and then moved all around because her dad was in the Army. So she's not really tied to one particular region, which I think is really interesting about her. And it's also interesting because at K-State, there are, it seems, in the English department specifically, it seems like there are a ton of professors from the East Coast who have come to Kansas. So they often talk about the regional differences they experience with the students at K-State. Caitlin and I as roommates have compared a lot of things regionally. For example, what we call a roundabout in Kansas, they call a rotary on the East Coast.
You would think that's not a big difference, but it really does feel like a big thing when you're moving from Connecticut to Kansas, to have this word that no one else knows, and you're like, oh, are we going past the rotary? And everyone's like, what's a rotary? It's like weird, and you're like, am I going crazy? People say that, right?
Yeah, so even like just on the basic language level, there's a difference. I don't know what it's like for people from like New York City to meet people from other places, because as someone from the Midwest, like you see New York City all the time in movies and TV, and like you just hear about it all the time. So like you have an idea, or you almost feel like you're kind of familiar with New York too, even though you're not one of the city folk. But I wonder, people from the East Coast, you know, meet someone from Kansas, they're like, Wizard of Oz.
My perception was completely based on Little House on the Prairie. I'm not even kidding.
Nice.
That's in my Antonia. That's why I came to Kansas expecting there to be no water, lots of prairie, and no trees. Because those books, that's how they describe the Midwest. And I was completely wrong in those perceptions.
And I think we always have trouble with this too, because we don't want to just buy into these stereotypes and be like, yes, people on the East Coast are mean and people in the Midwest are nice. I don't think the stereotypes are as, if they're partly true, they're not as extreme as we like think of them. You know, if we think of a stereotypical Midwesterner or East Coast person, there are tons of people who live in the different regions who don't even fit into the stereotypes at all. So like, where do we get those? And I don't know, maybe it's more of a societal practices. Like Caitlin talks about how they won't split checks for you as much on the East Coast, or they don't ask, like, would you like to split the check? Oh, that's fine. And they do that a lot in the Midwest, or at least the towns in the Midwest I've been in. And laws about, like, having pets able to be out in public in certain areas, like being able to walk your dog wherever you want.
And it can go on and on about all of the differences, like how I feel like everyone in the Midwest marries so early. Or, like, on the East Coast, it seems like it's perfectly acceptable to date someone for 6 or 7 years before you get married. But on the East Coast,
oh God,
you know,
I know
people who get married within 3 months. And that's, like, very different from on the East Coast. It seems like most people are like, well, there's no rush. Like, we have all the time in the world to get married. And, you know, it seems to be just like, oh, this one thing that we have to do. We have to plan this enormous ceremony and, you know, not such a big rush there. Right. And it also seems like people are, at least in terms of dating, like, it seems like there's a lot more casual dating on the East Coast than there is on the Midwest. It seems like a lot of people want serious kind of relationships on the Midwest.
Since Caitlin moved from Connecticut to Kansas, and she's dated some guys when she was on the East Coast, and then she did some dating when she first came to Kansas. And I remember her coming back to the apartment, talking about dates and stuff. It seemed like you were pointing out differences in dating guys from the East Coast to the Midwest. So I was curious if you could elaborate on that.
I don't know if anyone out there who's watching this right now watches the newsroom, but on the very first episode, Maggie is trying to get her boyfriend to meet her parents, and the boyfriend's like, I don't know, that's like a level 3, and I think we're at a level 2 right now. Don't you feel like that's a little too serious for where we are right now? And it seems like on the Midwest, there is no level 1 or 2. It seems like you go on one date, and then if you go on another date, even like 2 or 3 or 4 dates, it suddenly becomes this like serious thing, and
like it is a relationship,
right? And that's like not something on the East Coast that I feel like would happen. I feel like, you know, you need to have a conversation about being in a relationship for you to be in one, because otherwise people will just assume it's more casual and relaxed, which I think is a really big regional difference. I think when I was in Kansas, I had been on, I want to say like 2 or 3 friend dates. Like they were dates, but like nothing happened romantically to make you think that they were very serious. And the person wanted me to go meet their parents and their extended family at like a festival, a corn festival. I'm not gonna lie, sorry. And
it just makes it better.
In Kansas, and it, you know, it reminds me of that newsroom episode. I'm like, are we at a level 3 right now? Because I was generally thinking we're down at level 1, and it seems like everything in terms of intimacy and seriousness moves a lot faster on the Midwest. So before we wrap up, I was actually kind of interested, maybe as a nice way to end this segment, in thinking about similarities, because one of the things that Emi has said to me before, and I find it really interesting, is that everyone's so focused on differences in gender, like, oh, women are more emotional and men are more logical, and this came up a lot when we were talking with Ryan about gender and biology. And so it seems like in my discussions about region, people are always asking me, oh, are people in Kansas so much different than people in Connecticut? And I'm like, no, they're mostly the same. So is it even useful to focus on these differences, or...
Right, like Caitlin and I find it really interesting and kind of like fun to talk about the differences, but I don't know if it serves any greater purpose than that, than kind of like, you know, interesting entertainment for us. But is that helpful at all in building like relationships or connections? I mean, the differences are, I think, important to maybe be aware of or recognize in case of miscommunication or misunderstanding and that kind of thing. But as a human race, we're really similar. Like, people are really similar. The way we operate and think and are motivated and stuff, it's like so similar. So sometimes I wish people would point out the similarities, because I think they're there, but we just never talk about them really, or it doesn't seem like we talk about them.
Yeah, and I'm always really worried whenever I talk about the differences between cultures. I feel like, am I fetishizing this other culture and focusing on thinking about the Midwest as a whole, and comparing them and calling everyone in the Midwest this one thing? Oh, everyone in the Midwest is nicer. Everyone wants to get married earlier. How much am I taking who people in the Midwest are and making them into something they're not?
I guess I just have to constantly remind myself, like, what stereotypes are versus what real people are, you know?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's always important to keep in mind that even if we can generalize, like, how useful are these generalizations, and, you know, obviously you shouldn't apply them to everyone. You can't just be like, oh, I met you today, you're from the Midwest, clearly you're much nicer than all the other people in Connecticut. That would be making a judgment that is probably not true.
And it sucks because that's one of the easiest things to talk about when it comes to like small talk and meeting someone new, and like you ask them questions about themselves so that you can start categorizing them in your mind. So once you learn where they're from, even if you don't sincerely like believe or know yet if they're a certain way, if they fit the stereotypes of that region, you're gonna like joke with them about it, like, oh, you must be a farmer if you're from the Midwest, because like that's a shared cultural knowledge, and like they realize that you're trying to get to know them.
We're running out of time as usual.
Thank you again for watching post-grad seM.A.ntics. We're going to try to be posting 2 10-minute sections each week from now on, and we hope you enjoyed it.